What's up everyone, and welcome back to another skill-capped tier list. 1025 is jam-packed with item and champion changes, so you've come to the right place to get the full breakdown on everything and what the meta will look like. As always, we've put our challenger players to work, combined with using up-to-date statistics to give you guys the most accurate tier list possible. ADCs will end up being the biggest winners this patch, as a handful of their items are getting some really big buffs. Yasuo, Yone, and Lee are all getting buffed, while some OP picks like Samira, Jhin, and Kayn will finally be hit with nerfs. On another note, how's everyone's preseason going so far? What are you enjoying the most? We'd love to hear them down in the comments below. And while you're down there, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our tier lists in the future. With all that being said, let's get right into it, as there's a lot for us to cover. Let's start off by running down the item nerfs. Slowly but surely, tanks will continue to become weaker, as Bami Cinder will see a cost increase from 1000 to 1100, which will hit tanks' early item spike in certain situations. On top of that, Sunfire Aegis will have its health decrease from 450 down to 350. Frostfire Gauntlet will receive two nerfs, one to the slow size radius going from 275 down to 250, and the other to the mythic passive size increase, which will be lowered from 7.5% down to 6%. Turbo Chem Tank is the final tank item being nerfed, as the slow duration will be decreased from 2 down to 1.5 seconds. All in all, these changes will help to even out the playing field a little more, but won't remove tanks from the meta. Unless Riot addresses the immense amount of damage these items allow tanks to do, they won't be going anywhere anytime soon. A few lethality items will see some nerfs, the biggest being the range part of Eclipse. The shield value will be reduced from 100 plus 30% bonus AD down to 70 plus 20% bonus AD. This will end up hurting lethality ADCs like Jhin, Misfortune, Senna, and Graves. With Jhin also receiving some direct nerfs, which we will discuss later on, he will be dropping in power level by a decent amount for next patch. Lethality champs love to buy the Collector, which will see a smaller nerf. Instead of the execute damage proccing on everything, it will now only proc on champions. Duskblade will also be nerfed, as the slow will no longer proc for ranged champs. The final two item nerfs are targeted towards mages. Seeker's Arm Guard will have its AP reduced from 30 down to 20. This will help a little bit in dropping the insane cost efficiency of the item, but won't stop mages from purchasing it against heavy AD comps. And if you've been following the meta for the past patch, Muramana has started to become a staple on mage champions because its bonus damage is able to be procced by all sources of damage. But that won't last any longer though, as Muramana's bonus damage will now only proc on physical damage abilities. Not only will this hit all the mages buying this item, it will also nerf traditional users like Ezreal, as his W, E, and ult will no longer benefit from the bonus damage. That's all for the item nerfs. Let's now move on to breaking down the buffs. Crit ADCs will see the cost decrease for a lot of their items in this patch. Zeal will be decreased from 1200 down to 1050. Phantom Dancer, Rapid Fire Cannon, and Mortal Reminder will also be cheaper, going from 2700 down to 2500. These buffs will allow crit ADCs to hit their spikes slightly sooner and become more relevant earlier on in the game, which is something a lot of them have been struggling with so far in preseason. That's just the half of it though, as a bunch of other ADC items will be receiving stat buffs instead of cost reductions. Gale Force will get its AD increased from 55 to 60, along with its active dash cooldown decreased from 90 to 60 seconds. With neither Kraken Slayer nor Shield Bow receiving buffs for this patch, Gale Force will now become a really interesting option on a lot of ADCs. The dash cooldown being reduced by a full 30 seconds is huge and will give ADCs so much more consistent mobility. Be sure to try this out on a bunch of your crit ADCs, especially Jhin. He's already been doing great with Gale Force before the buffs, and with Eclipse being nerfed, it will become that much stronger on him for 1025. Essence Reaver will have its AD increase from 50 up to 55, which will help out ADCs like Lucian and Xayah. Lord Dominik's AD will also be increased, going from 30 to 35. This change is the least impactful of all, as most ADCs don't even get to a point in the game to where they're able to reach Lord Dominik's anyways. Mercurial Scimitar will receive a nerf to its cost, as it's being increased from 2900 to 3000. To compensate though, the AD will be increased from 30 to 40. This ends up being a buff, as 10 AD is worth more than 100 gold, but won't really do much for ADC's power level overall. The final ADC item change is to Infinity Edge. Instead of granting 8% extra crit damage for every 20% you purchase, you will now gain 35% extra crit damage once you have purchased 60%. Overall, we have a nicer 3 item spike for ADCs in this patch, but we're not done with bot lane yet. Supports will also see a ton of item buffs for 1025. First, Bando Glass Mirror will have its cost reduced from 1050 to 950. All 4 of the mythic support items will see a cost decrease as well, going from 2700 down to 2500. However, the stats on the items will be changed as well to compensate. Imperial Mandate will see its initial proc damage nerfed from 60 scaling to 100 down to 36 scaling to 60. This change will actually be more of a nerf to mid laners who are abusing this right now, like Aurelion Sol. To make the item stronger in a duo lane though, the ally proc damage will be buffed from 60 scaling to 100 up to 90 scaling to 150. What we can take away from these changes is that Riot doesn't want mid laners abusing this item, and they only want supports purchasing it from here on out. Moonstone Renewer will get a buff as well. The initial heal will be increased from 60 scaling to 90 up to 70 scaling to 100. The heal multiplier while in combat is getting nerfed though, going from 25% per second up to 100 max down to 12.5% per second up to 50 max. Shurelya's bonus damage buff is being decreased slightly, from 40 scaling to 60 down to 35 scaling to 55. And then for Locket, the shield is getting slightly nerfed as well, going from 250 scaling to 420 down to 230 scaling to 385. Overall, with the cost reduction of 200 on all these items, it should outweigh the small nerfs each item received and end up being a net buff for all supports. A few more support items are being changed, with Staff of Flowing Water and Ardent Censer getting a buff to their build path. Instead of having to buy a Blasting Wand as a component, both items will now have an Amplifying Tone in the build path and still cost 2,300 gold, making it so that you aren't sitting on upwards of 800 gold waiting for that Blasting Wand. Zeke's Convergence is the final support item getting changed. The heal will be decreased from 300 down to 250, and the armor from 30 down to 25. However, the mark duration and damage will be increased. The mark duration will go from 4 to 8 seconds, which really opens the window up to proc Zeke's, and the damage will be increased from 25 scaling to 50 up to 35 scaling to 70. By nerfing the tank stats and increasing the damage, it will now make Zeke's a more enticing pickup when snowballing early on. The final 2 changes to items for 1025 are to the mid lane mythics. Luden's ability haste will be increased from 10 up to 20, but the magic penetration will be decreased from 10 down to 6. Everfrost will receive a straight up buff, as its ability haste will be going from 10 up to 20. Everfrost has been the least appealing mage mythic so far in preseason, so with this change it should push it more in lane with the others. Ahri is one champion that has done very well with Everfrost in 1024, so we definitely recommend trying it out on her now. With all of those item changes out of the way, let's move on to the champion changes and tier lists for each role. For top lane, we have 5 champions having changes. Let's first take a look at Kayle. Her base magic resist is being reduced from 34 to 30, and her E's passive on-hit AP ratio is going from 25 to 20%. It looks like Riot plans on letting Kayle down easy, as these changes won't be enough to drastically force her down the tier list. If anything, these changes hurt her more for mid than top. Kayle currently holds one of the highest top lane win rates at 53%, and with this change that should only drop at max 2%. You have to keep in mind that with the nerfs to tank items, those champions will also become weaker, which will lessen the blow to Kayle. For now, Kayle will be holding on to the OP tier slot for another patch, but only by a sliver, as any other change or adjustments to the meta will force her down to S in 1026. Up next, we have some massive changes to Pantheon, which are intended to force him away from a support and transition him into being a top laner. His base movement speed is being reduced from 355 to 345. His Q cooldown will be reduced from 10 scaling down to 8 to 8 scaling down to 6. The mana cost on Q will also be reduced, going from 40 to 30. But its utility will be removed as it will no longer slow. W's damage will be getting a massive increase, as it's going from 60 scaling to 140 up to 60 scaling to 260. To take away from Pantheon his support viability, his E will no longer block tower shots, and the empowered E will not extend the duration. To give some power back to lane Pantheon, his E retreat movement penalty will be lowered from 50 down to 25%. He will also gain 60% move speed for 1 second when he uses E. And finally, his ult will now slow for 50% and apply an unempowered spear's worth of damage. All in all, with so many changes, it's likely going to take a patch or 2 to really hone in on lane Pantheon strength. But as for now, we will place him in A tier and keep a close eye on him as the patch progresses. Mordekaiser has been struggling to find his ground in preseason, so Riot will be giving him a little buff. His Q isolation damage will be increased from 20 scaling to 40% up to 30 scaling to 50%. This change will help him slightly, but it won't be enough to shift him up on the tier list. He will remain in A tier for another patch. With all the tanks out in full force, you'd expect the big dog to be eating well in preseason, but that really hasn't been the case. Even after getting some buffs towards the end of Season 10, Nasus still remains outclassed. Riot will be giving him the ability to farm stacks faster next patch, as his Q cooldown will be reduced from 8 scaling down to 4 to now 7.5 scaling down to 3.5. All in all, 0.5 seconds off really won't do anything significantly for Nasus, and for that reason he will remain in the B tier. The final top laner receiving some changes for 1025 is Irelia. Her base AD will be increased from 63 up to 65, and Q cooldown will be shaved off by 1 second at all ranks. Pretty similar to the Nasus change, you shouldn't expect too much out of this one either. Irelia currently holds a sub 45% win rate in preseason, so she's not doing too hot. We had her all the way down in C tier for 1024, so we'll give her the nudge up to B with this change for 1025. By no means will she become an optimal pick though, so we still wouldn't recommend her as a top pick to climb with. Breaking down the top lane tier list now, the OP tier will have Malphite, Shen, Kayle, and Camille. With the tank item nerfs, Malphite and Shen will become slightly weaker for this patch, but our analysts don't believe it will be enough to force them down the list. If anything, bruiser top laners become slightly stronger for this patch, so watch out for Camille and Darius. Gangplank and Tryndamere will be moving up on the list due to seeing some more success after their buffs last patch, and also getting indirect buffs with crit item changes in this patch. Our low elo picks of the patch include Malphite, Darius, and Kayle. Our analysts would recommend you ban out the exact same champs as well. Malphite counters so many meta bruiser picks, Darius's laning power is extremely hard to match, and Kayle will still remain a scaling god for 1025. With top lane covered, let's dive into the jungle now, where there are a ton of different changes. Kayn will finally be nerfed as his base armor will be reduced from 38 to 35. His Q's base damage will be lowered by 10 at all ranks, and the cooldown will be nerfed by 1 second at all ranks. These 3 changes combined will definitely wound Kayn a little, but we don't see him dropping out of OP tier just yet. Kayn has held a 55% win rate throughout all of preseason, and even if these nerfs drop that by 2 or 3%, he would still be in the OP tier range. For now, we will be keeping him in the OP tier, but if the changes end up being more impactful than we expect, we will drop him down to S for next patch. Nevertheless, he will still remain a super strong jungle pick, and one of the best to climb with even after these nerfs. Warwick will receive a buff to his passive's on-hit damage. The base damage will be increased from 8 scaling to 42 up to 12 scaling to 44, and it will now have a 50% bonus AD ratio along with a 10% AP ratio. This will give Warwick a nice little early game boost while also giving him some more scaling strength. It won't be enough to turn him into an S tier jungler though. We will be keeping him down in A tier for 1025. Riot will be putting some power into the Monkey King's jungle clear, as his E will now deal 150 bonus damage to monsters. Like Warwick, Wukong is a pretty average jungle pick right now, and despite this buff, our analysts don't believe Wukong will move up from A. Rengar has been in the dumps for the beginning of preseason, holding down one of the lowest win rates for any champion at 42%, so he's in dire need of some buffs. The Tiamat changes really hurt Rengar's ability to jungle in preseason, so Riot will be giving him some strength back into his clear. His W's extra healing from monsters will be increased from 50% up to 100%, and his W will now deal 65 scaling to 135 bonus damage to monsters. This change will definitely increase Rengar's viability for next patch, but he still won't be a top tier pick. We will be moving him up into B tier as he will now be a pretty average viable jungle pick. Despite his massive success in the mid lane, Echo Jungle hasn't been doing too well in preseason. His clear is extremely weak right now, so similar to the Rengar and Wukong buffs, Riot will be giving Echo more damage to monsters. His passive damage to monsters will be increased from 150 up to 250%. Echo will phase dive up into A tier due to this change for 1025. One of Riot's most controversial champions right now is Taliyah, who will be receiving a couple of small buffs. Her Q damage to monsters after the first hit will be increased from 50 up to 100%, and its work ground radius will be lowered from 450 down to 375. This change will lift Taliyah up a little further out of the gutter, but seeing the day of light is still a ways off. We will keep Taliyah down in C tier for now, but may adjust her up into B tier for next patch if the changes are more impactful than we originally think. Another painfully weak jungler is Karthus, who will also be getting a few buffs. His Q's mana cost will be reduced from 20 scaling to 44 down to 20 scaling to 40, and its AP ratio will go from 30 to 35%. Considering Karthus has been sitting down in the grave with a 44% win rate in preseason, we aren't really sure why Riot is going so light with this buff. We will move him out of D tier and into C tier, but he's still in need of some more changes to bring him to viability. Riot's trend in buffing 44% win rate junglers continues, as Nidalee will also get a few buffs for 1025. Her Q's minimum damage will be increased from 70 scaling to 130 up to 70 scaling to 150, and the AP ratio will be increased as well from 50 up to 70%. The max damage will receive a similar buff, going from 210 scaling to 390 up to 210 scaling to 450, but the AP ratio will remain the same. Q's mana cost will be lowered from 50 scaling to 90 down to 50 scaling to 70, and E's mana cost will be lowered from 60 scaling to 120 down to 50 scaling to 90. All four of these changes combined should give Nidalee a good boost in power for 1025. For higher elos, we can see her moving into A tier, but for low elo, we still see her as a C tier pick, so we will be placing her in the B tier. With how low Lee Sin's win rate has been in preseason, you'd honestly think the people playing him are blind. He's been struggling even more than Nidalee, sitting around 43%. As a result, he will be getting some pretty nice buffs. His base armor will be increased from 33 to 36. W's cooldown is being reduced from 14 to 12, and his E damage is getting buffed by 20 at all ranks, which is a really nice buff to his early game. We're taking the same approach with Lee as we did with Nidalee when placing him for this patch. For high elo, we expect him to clip A tier, but for low elo, he will still be down in C tier. B tier is the average between those two, which is where he will find his home for this patch. Gragas will be getting some rather underwhelming buffs compared to what we saw for Lee. His passive healing will be increased from 6 to 8% of his max HP, and his W cooldown will be decreased from 6 to 5 seconds. Gragas has been on the edge of B tier for most of preseason, so we will give him the bump for this patch, but that doesn't mean he'll be anywhere near the level of most other junglers. And the final jungle buffs will be going to our friend of the forest, and they're actually pretty solid. Ivern's Q cooldown is lowered from 14 scaling to 10 to now 12 scaling to 8. His E's shield AP ratio will be increased from 80 to 90%. The cooldown on his E will get the same buff as Q. It will be reduced by 2 seconds at all ranks. Lastly, Daisy's attack speed will get a small buff, going from 0.62 up to 0.7. With these changes, Ivern's mid-game teamfighting and utility will get a nice bump in strength for 1025. With that in mind, we will be moving him from B tier up into A. With all those jungle changes covered, let's dive into the tier list. With the nerfs to Bammy Cinder and Sunfire, the majority of tank junglers will be moving down slightly. This means carry junglers like Kha'Zix will have an even easier time squashing his opponents now, and will make the leap up into OP tier, joined by Nunu and Kayn. With a few of the tanks dropping down, a couple of carry junglers will trade spots with them on the list, as Fiddle, Olaf, and Evelynn will now move up into S tier. Our low elo picks will consist of Nunu, Rammus, and Mumu. Despite the tank nerfs this patch, these champions will still reign supreme in the lower elo brackets. The best bans for 1025 will be Kha'Zix, Kayn, and Hecarim. All these champs are played at an absurdly high rate and are very strong in the meta, so they are well worth your ban. Let's now move over to the mid lane, where there are a bunch of changes too. Fizz, who has arguably been the strongest mid laner throughout preseason so far, is getting nerfed. His mana per level will be reduced from 57 to 37. It seems that Riot is keeping it relatively light with the nerfs this patch. Fizz has held a 54% win rate throughout all of preseason, so you would expect something similar to what Kayn got at least. If anything, this change now means Presence of Mind will become stronger on Fizz, but shouldn't really bring his overall power level down much at all. He will remain in our OP tier for mid. Morgana mid will actually be receiving a nerf for this patch. Despite her low play rate, she's held one of the highest mid win rates throughout preseason, so Riot feels the need to tone her down slightly. Morgana's W damage will be reduced from 12 scaling to 60 down to 12 scaling to 52. This change should end up being pretty negligible for the most part. We will be keeping Morgana in S tier from mid lane for now. One of the best performing mids in low elo right now, Annie will be getting a nerf to her E movement speed. It will be going from 30 scaling to 60% down to 20 scaling to 50%. This will hurt her ability to escape ganks and engage a little bit for 1025, but she's going to need something more to drop her down the list. She will hold down a spot in S tier as one of the better mids for another patch. Now, despite everyone's initial assumptions on the AD Assassin items being OP, many of the AD Assassins have been struggling quite a bit in preseason. Talon has actually seen more success over the past patch with a bruiser build of Gore Drinker and Black Cleaver combined with Conqueror as his keystone. Riot will be buffing the return damage of his W from 45 scaling to 125 up to 45 scaling to 145. This buff combined with the new setup on Talon may push him over the top for this patch. Once players start to understand that Assassin Talon isn't as strong and adapt to the bruiser build, we predict his win rate will spike quite a bit and we will be bumping him to S tier as a result. Anivia will be receiving a boatload of different buffs for 1025. Her auto attack missile speed will be increased from 1500 to 1600. Although it's only being increased by 100, Anivia mains will more than welcome this change, as CSing with her awfully slow auto speed can be excruciating. Her Q will now chill enemies that it passes over. This is a nice quality of life buff to whenever you're not able to recast Q for the stun due to being CC'd. The pass-through damage on her Q is being lowered. However, the explosion damage will be increased. The cooldown on her Q will receive a 1 second nerf in the early game but a 1 second buff at max rank. The mana cost of her Q will be lowered from 80 scaling to 120 down to 80 scaling to 100, and the missile speed will be increased from 800 to 950. Overall, these are great changes to Anivia's Q. A bit less pass-through damage in exchange for all the other buffs is a great trade-off. Her E will be receiving 2 different buffs. The mana cost will be lowered from 50 scaling to 90 all the way down to just 40 at all ranks. Its damage will be increased as well, going from 50 scaling to 150 up to 60 scaling to 180. Its AP ratio is also buffed, going from 50 to 60%. Lastly, her ultimate will be changed in 3 different ways. The damage will be lowered, going from 40 scaling to 80 down to 30 scaling to 60, but the cooldown and mana costs are being lowered. The mana cost is lowered from 75 to 65 on first use, and the mana per second will be lowered from 40 scaling to 60 down to 35 scaling to 55. The craziest change here is to her ultimate's cooldown. It will be going from 6 at all ranks down to 4 at rank 1, 2.5 at rank 2, and only 1 second at rank 3. This will give Anivia the ability to reposition her ult much more frequently in fights, which will make her feel so much better to play. Overall, with any massive champion change like this, it's hard to super accurately predict where Anivia will land on the tier list for this first patch, but we expect her to be around an A or S tier pick. We will be placing her in A for now, but we'll keep a close eye on her throughout the patch and make adjustments as needed for 1026. Seraphine mid will be getting a couple of buffs for 1025. Her HP per level will see an increase from 80 up to 90, and her W's shield will be increased by 50% for Seraphine only. Even though her play rate for mid is a lot lower than support, she actually has the better win rate as a mid laner right now. So these buffs will only make her that much better. She will remain in the A tier, but don't sleep on this pick because she could very easily find herself creeping up into S in the coming patches. Everyone's favorite brother duo will fittingly receive the exact same buff for 1025. Yasuo and Yone's attack speed per level will both be increased from 2.5% up to 3.5%. Combine these changes with the Phantom Dancer and Infinity Edge buffs and both champs will become quite a bit stronger for 1025. They do hold down super low win rates at about 45% before these changes, so even though their power level will increase a good amount, relative to other mid laners it will still be quite low. We will be placing them in B tier, but another small buff in 1026 and they could find themselves in A tier. With all the mid changes covered, let's take a look at the tier list. The OP tier will consist of the same picks as last patch, with Fizz and Kayle still on top despite their nerfs, followed by Galio, Malphite, and Echo. We've adjusted a few picks from last patch, moving Victor down from OP into S and Katarina from S down into A. The nerfs to Victor and both of their core items in 1024 hit them harder than we originally expected, which is why we're moving them down now. Watch out for Pantheon mid this patch, as the changes we talked about for top lane will also be really nice for him in mid. Our 3 low elo recommendations will be the exact same as last patch with Malphite, Annie, and Malzahar. The best bans for this patch will be Fizz, Zed, and Akali. They're all very strong assassins who are picked a ton in the meta, so they're well worth your ban for sure. As for ADC, the role will find a pretty interesting shift in meta for 1025. The 2 OP picks of the previous patch, Jhin and Samira, will both be receiving nerfs. Jin's Q bonus AD ratio will be reduced from 45 scaling to 75% down to 35 scaling to 65%. With Eclipse also being nerfed this patch, Jin will take a decent hit but will hold on to a spot in OP tier. With the Gale Force buffs making the item the perfect substitution for Eclipse, Jin will continue to perform extremely well in 1025. The setup may just look a little different. We would recommend trying out a Gale Force rush into Storm Razor and then Fire Cannon, as that's been his best performing crit build. As for Samira, she won't be getting off as easily as Jin. She's already been slipping a little bit due to her nerfs last patch, and these ones will hurt even more. Her passive knockup will now only work on knocked up enemies instead of on any immobilizing CC. This will drastically decrease her all-in potential and synergy with a lot of hard CC supports. It gets even worse though, as her Q and ultimate lifesteal will be cut down by 33%, going from 100% down to 66%. Her sustain will become so much weaker and won't be healing for nearly as much on her shield bow and bloodthirster spike. With all these changes, we will be dropping Samira down into A tier for 1025. Twitch is the only ADC who will be buffed. His Q attack speed will go from 30 scaling to 50% up to 40 scaling to 60%. W slow will be buffed by 5% at all ranks, and his ultimate bonus AD increased from 20 scaling to 40 up to 25 scaling to 55. He will be squeaking out of B tier and into A for 1025. With a few of the big dogs dropping in power, our ADC tier list sees a pretty big shakeup for 1025. The OP tier for ADC will consist of Kai'Sa, Vayne, Jhin, and Swain. Vayne and Kai'Sa will both be moving up due to sitting very close to OP tier in previous patches. With the crit buffs along with Samira and Jhin being nerfed, it indirectly makes them stronger. With both Collector and Eclipse being so core in Misfortune and the both of them getting nerfed, we will be dropping her down to S tier. Ezreal will be dropping from A down to B tier due to the Manamune nerfs hitting him pretty hard. The three low elo picks for ADC will be Misfortune, Swain, and Ashe, and the best bans will now be Kai'Sa, Vayne, and Jhin. With Samira's nerfs, she will no longer be the must ban she has been in previous patches. Finally, for support, it's a lot lighter than what we saw for the other roles. Lulu will now have 25% increased damage on her Q if both bolts hit her target. The Q damage will be changed from 80 scaling to 200 to 70 scaling to 210 to compensate. Her Q will no longer deal less damage if it passes through a target, but to make it not become so OP in solo lane though, her Q will deal 70% damage to minions. Overall, this will buff support Lulu, which is rather strange. She's already a top tier support pick currently in preseason, so it's quite odd that she's the champion getting buffed out of all the weaker supports. Already an S tier support in 1024, Lulu will now jump into OP for 1025. Now even though the Seraphine buffs we discussed were targeted towards mid lane, they also buff support Seraphine too. She will be moving up into A tier. Taking a look at the support tier list, we have Lulu, Leona, and Janna in the OP tier. We've adjusted the list a little bit from last patch since we've started to get a better grasp of the meta. Brand and Zyra will now be in S tier instead of OP because of this. Even though Brand and Zyra are still super strong solo queue picks, Leona, Janna, and Lulu are all on a level above everyone else right now, so we want to represent that accurately. A couple of other adjustments include Pantheon dropping from A down to B due to support nerfs. Despite the Morgana nerfs are targeted towards mid lane, they won't affect her in the support role at all, and she will still maintain her S tier slot. Our low elo picks will still include Leona, Zyra, and Brand, as nothing changes here from last patch. And the best bans will be 2 picks from the OP tier with Lulu and Leona, and then Morgana from the S tier. They're all super strong picks right now, and they counter so many of the meta champs. Alright everyone, that is finally going to conclude the skill capped patch 1025 tier list. This was one massive patch to say the least, so we hope we were able to make it a little less overwhelming for you in this video. If you guys enjoyed it, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss another tier list down the road. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.